Barent, for the kind introduction, and it's great to see you, of course, and everyone else. So it is now evening in Hong Kong. So I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint with you. So I just want to say that in many ways, this talk represents a kind of transition between some of my previous projects, which you may be familiar with, and sort of new uncharted territory for me. So there are some ideas, some concepts that I'm going to be working with. They might not be entirely that mature. So I am also hoping to use this talk as a kind of conversation to hear your thoughts and your questions, your critiques, your insights about some of the ideas that I share with everyone. The topic for today is called Chinese Merchants and Settlers, the Third Force in the Contest for Supremacy in Mainland Southeast Asia. So this covers a 300-year period. But really, I think where my project is going to concentrate next is going to be in the later period, going from the late 18th to the 19th century. Okay, so we're actually going to start. In many ways, we're tracing the history of the maritime Chinese communities in southern China, as well as ports across Southeast Asia, and just sort of examining their role, the different roles that they played. I think it's very important to think about these Chinese networks in terms of networks, looking at them in terms of horizontal histories, examining how they, for instance, related to one another, connected to each other across different port cities, the networks of trade, religion, and culture that sort of spread across maritime East Asia. And so Chinese migration from southern China to Southeast Asia is a very, very long story. But I think the point when it becomes consisting of very durable networks really occurred during the 16th century. And I think one major impetus came as a result of sort of the first wave of European expansion into the region. So we began with the story of the Portuguese establishing a foothold in Southeast Asia with the occupation of Malacca in 1511. Malacca formerly being a very important tributary state of the Ming. And from Malacca, the Portuguese became very much attracted to the sort of strong, robust, complementary economies of China and Japan, where Chinese silk was able to exchange for Japanese silver, which was needed in large amounts in the Ming dynasty. But the Ming had its own prohibitions against private trade and travel. When those prohibitions were strictly enforced amid commercialization, there was a rampant piracy along the coastline. So the Portuguese were able to take advantage of the irregular contacts between China and Japan to, first of all, establish a foothold in Macau in the 1550s. And as a result of their intervention into the domestic politics of Japan, especially between rival warlords, the Portuguese were able to establish a sort of foothold in Nagasaki by 1571. So therefore, they were able to open up a legalized and extremely profitable channel of trade between China and Japan. So in the meantime, the Ming dynasty, after putting down piracy along its coast, realized that keeping the maritime prohibitions and relegating all trade within the sort of tributary framework was counterproductive. And so the Ming court in 1567 decided to open up Moon Harbor, or Yuegang, Zhangzhou Prefecture in Fujian province, as a very heavily regulated and taxed, but nonetheless legitimate channel for outbound private overseas trade. So Chinese merchants and settlers were then able to go to Southeast Asia in large numbers. They were only allowed to go to Southeast Asia because Japan remained illegal for traders and settlers. So in the meantime, the Spanish competitors of the Portuguese had acquired a foothold in the Philippines, establishing Manila in 1571. And the Spanish brought with them a truly global network connecting Manila to the New World, Acapulco, as well as the silver mines of South America. And so the Ming had an alternative source of silver. Chinese were able to go in large numbers to Manila to take silver back to China. So now you see the establishment of the Portuguese as well as the Spanish in maritime East Asia. At the dawn of the 17th century, Japan, after undergoing unification, first under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and then the Tokugawa Bakufu, were also able to start outfitting official mercantile missions to Southeast Asia. So you see a large outflow of Japanese to different ports across Southeast Asia during the early 17th century, where Japan towns were formed. And Southeast Asia also became a very important meeting place between Japanese and Chinese merchants. And Taiwan, of course, enters into the picture as a sort of semi-legal, illicit trading emporium between Chinese and Japanese merchants. And the final piece of the puzzle was completed with the Dutch East India Company, which also barged into maritime East Asian trade in the 17th century. So just like the Portuguese and the Spanish, and perhaps even more than them, the Dutch had a very global network that connected Europe to Asia. And so the Dutch expanded in maritime Asia, largely at the expense of their Portuguese and Spanish competitors. So by 1640, they had taken control of the Portuguese outpost of Malacca. Even earlier, in the 1620s, they had established an Asian headquarters in Batavia. So the Dutch, too, wanted a piece of the China-Japan silk for silver trade. They wanted an outpost like Macau and Manila. So they eventually, after complex negotiations with the Ming court, established a foothold in southwestern Taiwan, where they then proceeded to colonize the entire island and to bring sort of the Chinese and Japanese there under its full control. Okay, so this actually brings us to what is happening in mainland Southeast Asia. So what was going on within that larger framework or context that's taking place in the late 16th century. So the center here, this is a country that we're going to be focusing a lot on because it represented a very key piece of the geopolitical puzzle in mainland Southeast Asia, and that's Cambodia. So just to really crash recall, Cambodia from sort of the 9th to the 14th century, maybe into the 15th century, had enjoyed a period of glory under the Khmer Empire, based in Angkor, present-day Siem Reap. And at its height, its sphere of influence had extended throughout most of mainland Southeast Asia, in what is today southern Vietnam, large parts of Siam, as well as the Malay Peninsula. However, the parts of the Khmer Empire gradually broke away, including Siam. And there emerged, an intense geopolitical competition between Cambodia and Siam. By the 15th to 16th centuries, Cambodia was gradually at a disadvantage, militarily, economically, every aspect, in the face of Siam, which had consolidated under Ayutthaya. However, at the same time, Cambodia, which was traditionally more agrarian focused, its coastline was becoming incredibly important as a kind of meeting point, as a node in maritime trade. So the formation of the trading system between China and Japan, Southeast Asia was a big part of it, because much of the profits from the trade with Japan then went to purchase Southeast Asian natural resources and luxury goods. And so the Cambodian coastline was very important in providing a kind of outlet for highland Southeast Asian natural products as well as luxuries. And in many ways, the competition between Siam and Cambodia was also economic and geopolitical in terms of the control of strategic resources and coastal routes. This sort of competition continued into the early decades of the 17th century, when you see the entrance of a major new player that posed an unprecedented threat to Cambodia to its east. And that was the sort of ascendant Vietnamese state. So the traditional heartland of Vietnamese culture and civilization was in the north, in the Red River Plain around Hanoi. However, the successive dynasties of Vietnam gradually expanded their footprint to the south, and gradually in successive stages, swallowing up a kingdom that once lay between Cambodia and Vietnam, known as Champa. Vietnamese forces had pretty much subjugated Champa by the end of the 15th century, leaving a kind of rump state. However, at this point, Vietnam under the Lê dynasty had become extremely overextended. It then broke off into the northern and southern halves, the north being known as Tonkin, the south being known as Cochin China. And the two sides fought a civil war until around 1672 or so. Now, as the two sides fought their civil war, and especially after the civil war ended in an inconclusive truce, Cochin China started focusing a lot on southern expansion. So what remained of Champa was swallowed up. And in the early 17th century, the Vietnamese, or the Cochin Chinese, to be specific, had obtained from Cambodia an outpost in what is today Saigon. And from Saigon, they would start, beginning their penetration into many other parts of the Cambodian coastline, as well as the Mekong River Delta. Okay, so now the Cambodian governing hierarchy was actually very conducive to interference from its neighbors, because it was a very, very decentralized system. Although you had a court with a king in charge, there were actually three major centers of power, each with their own court, their set of provinces under their control, and their own set of officials. The king was merely the one who possessed the most of them. But in addition to the king, there was a co-king who had once been king and abdicated, or was a brother of the king who could not legitimately succeed to the throne. So he's known as Upayu Raja. And then you had a viceroy. So he's mostly the heir apparent, or the successor to the king. He would also be kind of a center of power. So you can see it's actually very easy for a neighboring power like Siam or Vietnam to back one of these three, or even to encourage forces behind these three to compete with each other especially when it came to the succession of the throne. And so it was very easy to plunge Cambodia into succession disorder as well as civil war. Now, because trade became very, very important to Cambodia, um, the, the sort of foreign merchant communities were also very important inside the country as well. So during the dawn of the 17th century, you had Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, and Portuguese communities. Each of them had their own headman, known as a Shabandor, the master of port, and they would be in charge of each of these communities, ruling over them according to their own regulations. In addition to that, the Dutch East India Company established a factory, a sort of trading post in Phnom Penh, which became, the major economic center of Cambodia. Now, in addition to their mercantile functions, many of these foreign groups were also recruited by the Cambodian king, the viceroy, the co-king, as mercenaries, enlisted in the military. So initially, the Japanese and the Spanish and the Portuguese were heavily used as mercenary forces because of the weapons, because of the organization of their troops. The Japanese, in particular, had a very strong presence, actually, in coastal Cambodia. In fact, near the city of Messar, which is in present-day Vietnam, is known as Mito. There's actually place names that hint to a Japanese presence. There's, for instance, a Japanese island. And in fact, the main tributary of the Mekong River, if you look at Dutch sources, sometimes they call it the Japanese River. So this shows, that the Japanese were quite active, also as mercenaries in this particular area. The Spanish, of course, were very heavily involved in Cambodia. They tried backing even their own choice of king to the throne in the late 16th century. And Spanish adventurers had tried to dominate Cambodia. And actually, Cambodia formed part of a very crazy Spanish plan to somehow take control over all of China, which was actually a plan of Spanish adventurers in Asia. And this was brought before King Philip II of Spain. But it was too crazy, and for very good reason. The idea never went through. I mean, there's this notion that somehow a few hundred Spanish conquistadors would be able to take over the entire Chinese empire. Okay, so eventually, however, Chinese started becoming the major players in Cambodia as the 17th century went on. The Chinese were increasingly trusted as being very reliable. And also because the Chinese did not really receive any strong backing from the Ming dynasty. Unlike the Japanese, unlike the Spanish, there's some kind of state power behind them. The Ming had a very ambiguous relationship with Chinese merchants abroad. I mean, many of them were probably illegal. They were pirates. And so increasingly, they were being used in sort of supervisory roles in the Cambodian bureaucracy. So, for instance, under the supervision of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you had, two officials in charge of trade. One is the Master of the Seas, and these would, overlook Asian merchants, so Chinese, Japanese, Siamese. And then you have a Master of Foreigners, who would be mostly in charge of looking over the Europeans. Now, along the Gulf of Siam, coastal Cambodia, in the area of Ha Tien, which is on the present-day Vietnam-Cambodian border, the Cambodians had a province known as Piam, which literally means seaside or seashore. And that province actually had a governor who was most likely Chinese. the governor's title is known as Chen Zhongdok. Chen is Chinese in the Khmer language, and Chongtok is probably a corruption for Zongdu, a sort of military governor. So obviously, he was in charge of the defense of this very strategic area. And in fact, this province, later known as Hatien, was actually incredibly important because it lay on the maritime trading routes. Until well into the 19th century, if Siam wanted to launch a maritime invasion of Cambodia, or even beyond Cambodia into Vietnam, they had to go through Hatien. So, and likewise, if Cambodia wanted to counterattack or to somehow occupy Siamese territory, Hatien was also a very important staging ground. So this area already was a major defensive as well as commercial outpost. And Chen Chong-dok is mentioned many times in the sort of Cambodian royal chronicles. And this is actually more of a title than an individual because there were several individuals that went by that title, and on more than one occasion he was killed in action. So it's hard to bring the same person back to life. So it's probably more a title rather than an individual. So let's zooming back onto the maritime East Asian scene. As a result of just so many players in maritime Asia, right? You had the Dutch, you had the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Japanese, all very armed, all very violent. The Chinese merchants and pirates themselves started organizing to defend their commercial interests against the Europeans and as well as the Japanese. And this is in many ways why you see in Cambodia, the Chinese themselves are becoming recruited as mercenaries, being placed in charge of important roles. And so by the middle of the 17th century, the Chinese had achieved an unprecedented level of centralization under this man right here, Zhen Zhilong. And Zhen Zhilong was able to have a sort of private army and navy that would be able to defend his vast commercial trading interests that included Cambodia. So it was probably part of his network. And Zhen Zhilong was initially based in Taiwan, but later he went to Fujian. He surrendered to the Ming authorities, obtained legitimacy as a Ming Dynasty official, but nonetheless continued operating his own private army as well as navy. This arrangement broke down in 1644 when the Ming Dynasty collapsed. The Manchus entered China, founded the Qing Dynasty. There was significant resistance against the Qing in southern China from various southern Ming resistance movements. So the resistance along the coast, in particular in Western Guangdong. This group of people would be very important in how the situation in mainland Southeast Asia would subsequently shape up. So these people operated mostly in the Hazy area on the border between China and Vietnam. So initially, the Ming Loyalist forces came under Deng Yao. He was killed in a joint Qing-Vietnamese maneuver. And then afterwards, these three people would play a very important role in consolidating the anti-Qing resistance force in Western Guangdong. So Xian Biao, known in the Dutch sources as Piojia, or Biao Ye, which is probably the transcription. Yang Yendi, as well as Huang Jin. They are mentioned on many occasions in the Qing sources. But the Qing was also relentlessly after them. And by the early 1660s, the Qing had exterminated most of the resistance in Western Guangdong. And so as a result, many of these resistance groups then took shelter with the southeastern Chinese resistance movement under Zhen Zhilong's son and successor, Zhen Chenggong, otherwise known as Koxinga. But Zhen Chenggong himself was, mounting a very fierce resistance against Qing. But by the early 1660s, as the Qing dynasty consolidated control over all of mainland China, there was very little room for him on the mainland as well. So in 1662, Zhen Zhenggong drives the Dutch out of Taiwan, takes control of the island, and he and his descendants run the island as a kind of independent maritime Chinese kingdom. I think a lot of previous studies of the Zhen organization, well, including my own, have really tended to look at the Zhen in terms of cross-straits relations, have tended to look at the Zhen in terms of maritime East Asian trade. But I think what's also very important about what the Zhen did was that as a maritime Chinese political organization, they were able to establish a maritime dominance in East Asia. So in many ways, putting an end to the first round of European commercial and political and military expansion into maritime East Asia. So after the Zhen occupied Taiwan, the Dutch had really lost a strategic foothold. And the Dutch were really out to try to get back at the Zhen. So what unfolded was a very fierce competition between the Zhen and the Dutch over mainland Southeast Asia between 1663 and 1675. And much of this competition involved access to deerskin and natural resources. These were in great demand in Japan. And so there was a fierce competition between the Dutch and the Chinese, mostly under the Zhen, to sell to the Japan market. So then the story started unfolding, which was a group of Zhen partisans under Shen Biao, at the invitation of the Cambodian king at the time, Baron Richa, in 1665 or so. Shen Biao and a fleet consisting of several thousand Chinese landed in the Mekong Delta region. They established outposts there. They then gradually went to Phnom Penh, where they had an audience with this king. And the king himself was actually being faced with a lot of pressure, not just from Siam, but increasingly from Vietnam. In fact, his own co-king, the Ubayo Raja, Ong Tan, and after Ong Tan's death, his son Ong Nan, they were very much pro-Vietnam. And under their sponsorship, they encouraged a tremendous amount of Vietnamese settlement in the Mekong Delta as well as in Phnom Penh. And so for King Baron Richa, he saw the Zhen partisans under Shen Biao as a very important third force to counter both Siamese as well as Vietnamese designs, and as well as the other Europeans. So in 1666 and 1667, with the encouragement of this king, the Zhen partisans initiated what amounted to a genocide of Vietnamese settlers in Cambodia. And then afterwards, Shen Biao actually attacked the VOC factory there, killed the head of the factory. And as a result, by the 1670s or so, the VOC had closed down its Cambodia factory. So if you look at, by the end of the 17th century, you actually see a gradual withdrawal of the Dutch from mainland Southeast Asia to focus much more on its core territories on the Malay Peninsula and present-day Indonesia. And so in 1675, the Cambodian chronicles, as well as French missionary records, actually showed that King Ong Chi, who had succeeded Baron Richa, actually allied with a Zhen naval fleet from Taiwan, together with Siam, in a campaign against Ong Nan, who was very much pro-Vietnam. So you can see that the Zhen were heavily involved in the Mekong Delta. So you can argue that the Mekong Delta was a very successful Zhen colonization effort beyond Taiwan. And this is actually very, very. I think the evidence is very strong because actually, if you think about it, the Zhen were not just focused on Taiwan; they were also very interested, for instance, in occupying the Philippines. So this is probably a more famous story where the Zhen tried on several occasions to occupy Manila. However, the Qing were growing increasingly strong, and the Zhen effort gradually faltered in the face of Qing power. And so from 1682 to 1689, what this meant was that the Ming loyalist forces in the Mekong Delta gradually started to fracture. So Shen Biao, in 1682, he surrendered to the Qing. This is according to the Qing records. So this actually meant that Shen Biao's subordinates, so Yang Yanди as well as Huang Jin, they become the dominant force in the Mekong Delta. And what's very interesting, and so you can actually see that the Chinese were very independent at the time, right? So they were formerly allied with the Cambodian king, and now they switch alliances and become very good with Ang Nan, who is quite pro-Vietnamese. And Yang Yanди, according to certain Vietnamese sources, not entirely credible, right? So you got to take it with a grain of salt. But Yang Yandi somehow become sworn brothers with Ang Nan. So this is probably backed up in the Cambodian chronicles because Ang Nan takes a Chinese wife, right? So in some ways, probably this wife is related to Yang Yandi in some way. At any rate, in 1683, the Qing were able to occupy Taiwan. And before Taiwan surrendered to the Qing, there was a huge disagreement that broke out within the Zhen organization. There was a group of people who wanted to move overseas and somehow continue the resistance. However, the main group of the Zhen decided to surrender to the Qing under the Qing Navy under the command of Shi Long, who in fact was a former member of the Zhen organization. However, there was a Zhen relative known as Zhen Lusha, who actually refused to go along with the surrender. And so he and a group of people went into exile in the Mekong Delta before the actual Qing, the Zhen surrender. So because there were so many Ming loyalist exiles and Zhen family members in Southeast Asia, Shi Long actually had to send one of his subordinates named Cheng Ang, or the character reads Mao, depending on how it's interpreted. But from 1684 to 1688, Shi Long's naval forces patrolled across Southeast Asia. They went to different ports. Now, ostensibly, the reason was to announce to the Zhen remnants that the Qing dynasty had already, secured the surrender of the Zhen, so you need to submit to us. But this was also it's a show of force. And it's also a way of intimidating Southeast Asian rulers to prevent them from harboring Ming loyalists. And this is actually also a sign that the Qing dynasty had become a formidable naval power because they, in order to exterminate the Zhen, they had taken in a lot of defectors from the Zhen, people who were very familiar with the sea, who had naval expertise. They engaged in a tremendous shipbuilding effort. And so the Qing Navy, in fact, during the 1680s to the 1700s, was incredibly powerful. And so the Qing, under Cheng Ang, they were somehow able to deliver to the Cochin Chinese ruler, the Nguyen Lord, a letter from the governor of Guangdong requesting him to eradicate Yang Yandi as well as Huang Jin. So basically, further fractures emerged within the Ming loyalist movement. Yang Yandi He obviously was more friendly to the Qing. He probably wanted to surrender and go back to China. Huang Jing wanted to continue, so he assassinates Yang Yendi in 1688. And at this point, the Cambodian king, who's Ang Sor, he then prepares a campaign against Huang. And then so Huang then allies with the Cochin Chinese to try to go against the Cambodian king. So the Cochin Chinese, they sort of backstab him. They trick Huang to put him in charge, against the Cambodians. But then they ambush him and kill him. So at this point, the Cochin Chinese then back one of the subordinates of Huang Jin, known as Chen Shangchuan. Now, Chen Shangchuan was he wasn't really known. He was a very minor figure in all of these Ming loyalist resistance movements. And precisely because he was a minor figure, the Cochin Chinese back him up and bring him into a prominent position. So he was then given appointment as a very autonomous military governor of Saigon as well as the Mekong Delta. And so the Cochin Chinese then used Chen Shangchuan, engaging in alliance with him to fight against the Cambodian throne. So Chen Shangchuan's forces keep on fighting the Cambodians. They keep on getting depleted in numbers because, these campaigns were very costly in terms of manpower as well as weaponry. And at a certain point, Chen Shangchuan's forces were depleted to just several hundred people, some scores of ships. And then after Chen Shangchuan's death, the Cochin Chinese then used the excuse of some kind of crime to capture Chen Shangchuan's successor, Chen Dading, in 1732. So he was brought to the Cochin Chinese capital at Hue. He was put in prison, and he soon died. At this point, much of the remnants of Chen Shangchuan's Ming loyalist forces become incorporated into an emerging new Chinese center at Hatian. And so Hatian was founded by another person from Western Guangdong known as Mo Jiu. Now, we're not very sure, how Mo Jiu and the Western Guangdong Ming loyalist forces were related. They were probably related in some way. Mo Jiu, I think he probably came as part of this overall exodus to the Mekong Delta. So at first, Mo Jiu took refuge with the Cambodian king. He gained the king's trust. And as a result, he was able to obtain the governorship of Hatian, this very strategic area along the Gulf of Siam. And he was able to transform it into a hub of maritime Asian commerce. So eventually, Mo Jiu then paid tribute to Cochin China as well, even as he continued maintaining ties with Cambodia. And in that way, he really turned Hatian into a kind of independent center, politically as well as economically. Okay, so after the victory over Taiwan, so Hatian's status really benefited from the actions of the Kangxi Emperor. In 1684, Kangxi basically opened up the seas, allowing Chinese merchants to trade abroad. So this is very unprecedented. Even though later on the Qing did engage in some kind of maritime prohibitions from time to time, and they enacted, the Canton system, restricting foreigners from going to China, but Chinese going abroad to trade with very little interruption. This was the policy of the Qing dynasty. So the Chinese could continue to go abroad to different parts of maritime East Asia. And so this ushered in what many scholars have called the Chinese century in maritime East Asia. So this was a very long 18th century from the late 17th century to 1800. And this Chinese century was driven in many ways by the fact that the Qing was getting overpopulated. There were very few natural resources to support a growing population. So Southeast Asia became a place for natural resources, luxury consumption for Qing elites, as well as crucial minerals such as tin, also rice, right? And surplus Chinese labor was also able to go in large numbers abroad, to go to the plantations, to cultivate rice, to dig the mines. And these Chinese workers or laborers became a kind of captive market for Chinese manufacturing goods, such as tea, such as paper, all of these items. And Chinese spending power offshore was actually bigger than Chinese in China because of higher labor costs. So this is what's basically going on. So Mo Jiu dies in 1735. He was succeeded by his son, Mo Tianci. So more so than his father, what Mo Tianci did was to maintain sort of the independent position of Hadian. And he did so not so much by forming an independent state. He basically tried to maintain his autonomy by ensuring the profitability of his network. So he wanted to continue doing trade. He wanted to continue making money. So in many ways, his approach was very much like the Dutch East India Company. But what Mo Tianci did was to maintain multiple allegiances or to integrate himself into multiple hierarchies. So towards Vietnam, towards Cochin China, he received ranks and titles. So he integrated himself very well, paid tribute to the Nguyen Lord at Hue. But I think this is the most well-known story because, eventually the Mo get absorbed into Vietnam. But concurrently, what Mo Tianci was doing was that he maintained his involvement in Cambodia. He actually deepened his involvement. He assumed the title of Pria Sotwat, which actually denotes a minor relative of the royal family in Cambodia. And he was actually able to make use of this connection to even become the viceroy of Cambodia. So actually one of the junior kings. So he would have control over 5 coastal provinces, very strategic coastal provinces, giving him control over the entire Cambodian coastline. And so this is his Khmer letter to the Tokugawa shogun. And what's more, he cultivated very close ties with the Dutch East India Company. So he tried to pass himself off as a Malay port principality, interacting with other port principalities like Johor, like Palembang, trading with these sultanates in Sumatra. And so, and he also maintained very close ties with the Dutch East India Company headquarters in Batavia, as well as the Chinese networks there. And speaking about Chinese networks, he also was on very good terms with the Qing court. And so this is a sort of memorial or a letter to the Governor General of Guangdong and Guangxi, Li Shiyao, in 1770. So you can see, his tone is very respectful. He calls the Qing dynasty a celestial dynasty, which is very ironic considering that Hatian was founded as a kind of Ming loyalist outpost. Okay, so anyways, moving forward, because we really don't have that much time. But so Mo Tianci was very successful as long as he was able to maintain this kind of equidistant diplomacy, this balance of power. But this balance of power started to break down with disorder in Siam. So the Burmese or Myanmar was attacked and put an end to Ayutthaya in 1767. So Mo Tianci saw an opportunity he wanted to place a puppet Siamese king on the throne and to dominate the Siamese court from behind the scenes. However, he ran into the fierce competition of another ethnic Chinese from Chaozhou in eastern Guangdong, known as Taksin, who was actually a half Chinese, the son of a Chinese merchant, as well as a Siamese woman. And so the competition between Taksin and Mo Tianzi ironically occurred because of the expansion of trading networks. It occurred to dominate the very crucial sort of passageway, the trade routes between island Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, and the Chinese coastline. And what's more important, rice became a very important export for the Qing dynasty. And there were two major sources of rice, the Mekong Delta and the Chao Phraya Plain. And these two plains were the objects of fierce competition. At any rate, the competition between Daxin and Mo Tianzi evolved into a full-scale confrontation. Mo Tianzi lost this war. And so Taksin briefly occupied Hatian, but with Mo Tianzi removed as a kind of intermediary between Vietnam and Siam, this actually led to the first full-scale war between Siam and Cochin China from 1771 to 1772. This was the first of many confrontations that would last for well into the 19th century. In the end, this war was inconclusive, and they decided that, well, guess what? They probably needed Hatian and Mo Tianzi after all. So they invited Mo Tianzi back to Hatian, once again serving as a buffer between Vietnam and Siam. But Mo Tianzi saw another opportunity in a massive domestic uprising against the Nguyen rule, Cochin Chinese rule, with the Taizun in 1771. So the Taizun, first overthrew the Nguyen dynasty, the Nguyen in Cochin China. They were then able to overpower Tonkin, and they were able to bring all of Vietnam under a unified rule. But the Cochin Chinese court was forced to take exile in Saigon. And then Mo Tianzi felt that this was a great opportunity to manipulate the Cochin Chinese court. Long story short, he was not successful. The Taizun were able to quickly overwhelm him. And in the end, he was forced to flee to Bangkok under no other than Taksin. And then Taksin suspected him, probably, well, maybe with reason, of plotting to take over the Siamese throne. So he was forced to commit suicide in 1780. But Taksin did not live for long either. In 1782, an uprising in Siam overthrew him and led to the founding of the Chaki House, which is the current ruling dynasty of Siam. Eventually, the Taizun were defeated by a prince who would later become the Zalong Emperor of Vietnam. He founded the Nguyen dynasty, unifying all of Vietnam. So what you're actually seeing here towards the end of the 18th to the early 19th century was the beginning phases of state-building efforts in Southeast Asia, the efforts of very ambitious rulers in mainland Southeast Asia to fill in the boundaries, to take control of frontiers that were once very, very hazy and allowed for intermediary networks like the Chinese. But what's very interesting is that a lot of this state building was dependent on access to Western weapons as well as ships. Initially from the Dutch, Batavia was supplying a lot of the weapons. But gradually, there was a new influx of Europeans into maritime Asia, the British, the French, other European groups. And eventually, the British especially were able to establish a kind of maritime dominance. So with European control of the seas, with increasing efforts of Southeast Asian states to territorialize their boundaries, this led to narrowing room for autonomous Chinese networks. And eventually, these Chinese networks became much more economic in nature, much more in the service of these sort of ambitious state builders. People like Ram I, right, the founder of the Chaki clan in Siam, as well as Nguyen Anh, also known as Zalong in Vietnam. And with the removal of Chinese intermediaries who had been so important in mainland Southeast Asian politics, this meant that Vietnam and Siam would increasingly come into direct conflict with one another. Not so apparent at first, however, because initially, under Ram I and Zalong, Ha Tien under Mo Tian's successors remained a kind of hazy buffer zone between Vietnam and Siam. So in other words, Vietnam would assign the Mo descendants as governors of Ha Tien. So Ha Tien as a territory would be a part of Vietnam. But the Mo descendants themselves would spend their early lives as hostages in Bangkok. So the Siamese king had to approve, whenever there was a new Mo governor in Ha Tien, the Bangkok court had to approve the appointment of the Mo over to Ha Tien to allow him to travel there. And the Siamese king also had a strong say in terms of affairs in the Ha Tien area. What area were the Mo allowed to rule over? So in many ways, the Mo were descendants in the service to both kingdoms. And in some ways, the frontier zone continued to be able to operate because of this kind of hazy area between the Sinosphere tradition of tribute in Vietnam, as well as the rest of East Asia, and the sort of mandala vassalage systems in Southeast Asia. Under both systems, there was tribute from a lesser kingdom to a more central one. But the Sinosphere tradition was much more formalized and bureaucratic, more emphasis on territory, whereas the mandala vassalage was kind of more emphasizing on human beings or sort of human, chains of loyalty. So the Mekong River Delta, in many ways, where the Mo were located, was in that kind of hazy zone, where you would continue to allow people to have multiple allegiances, even though the territory itself was increasingly a part of Vietnam. So the Nguyen strategies towards Ha Tien going into the 19th century was to increasingly remove that kind of hazy zone. So there were many efforts to remove the Mo clan entirely from exercising real power and trying their best to have directly appointed people from the center. So initially, the kind of intermediary began to shift from the Ha Tien area to Saigon. So Saigon came under the leadership of a very powerful, sort of governor who ruled quite autonomously. His name was Le Van Zuet, and he basically ruled over the entire southern part of Vietnam as kind of his own autonomous fiefdom. So he became that kind of middleman between Vietnam as well as Siam. And under him were actually many Chinese and Chinese descendants in his service. But already under him, he was starting to assert greater control over this hazy frontier space. One of the big projects that was undertaken, not just under his initiative, but under the Zalong Emperor during his last years, was the construction of a massive canal that ran from north to south along the current-day Vietnam-Cambodia border. This is known as the Vinh Tay Canal. And this involved an effort, mobilization of Vietnamese as well as Khmer laborers. So this canal was dredged at a heavy cost of life to both Cambodians as well as Vietnamese. So besides the massive suffering that was endured, Vinh Tay Canal was also a physical kind of demarcation between Vietnam and Cambodia. So it's a physical symbol of kind of separation. Before that, what was Vietnam, what was Cambodia? Extremely hazy. But this was starting to become a lot more clear. After Zalung's death, he was succeeded by Minh Meng. And, under his rule of over 20 years, he adopted a sort of Confucian centralization policy that began to assert domination not just over territory, but on a conscious mission to civilize the entire population of the frontier areas, ironically, according to Chinese standards of civilization. So under him, in many ways, Vietnam began to assume the notion of a kind of middle kingdom. And, their sort of penetration into Ha Tien as well and Cambodia as a kind of civilizing mission. And so one of the things that Minh Meng did was to eliminate the last of the Saigon intermediaries. So after Le Van Zuet's death, he tried to take over. It led to a rebellion from his adopted son, Le Van Hoi, from 1833 to 1835. Very interestingly enough, the Mua governors of Ha Tien supported Le Van Hoi. So this rebellion was crushed in 1835. Now, meanwhile, in Cambodia, King Ang Chan, who served both Siam and Vietnam, but was rather friendly to the Vietnamese, he passed away. So Vietnam took advantage of this opportunity to not just take over Saigon directly, as well as Ha Tien, but also to insert unprecedentedly, a woman onto the Cambodian throne. So Ang May, who became a puppet of the Vietnamese. Although Ang May continued to rule as a queen, Vietnam essentially engaged in a full-scale occupation of Cambodia. They actually named Cambodia the name of Chente Garrison, or pacifying or subduing the West. And this was seen as a wholesale civilizing project of the Khmer people. So the Khmer officials were forced to adopt Vietnamese clothing, which themselves were kind of based on Chinese classical costumes, Ming Dynasty costumes. But at any rate, so you can see, but with the removal of all of these intermediaries, this led to the bloodiest and most full-scale confrontation between Vietnam and Siam, which occurred between 1840 to 1845. The result was a stalemate. And in the end, Vietnam and Siam decided to accept a new ruler named Ang Duong, who would basically serve both Vietnam as well as Siam. And in fact, Ang Duong was a bit more leaning towards Siam than Vietnam. And so this is the situation in Cambodia in the middle of the 19th century. So what prompted this kind of truce in 1845? If you look around what's happening in mainland Southeast Asia, you see there's increasing pressure coming from the European powers, especially British and French geopolitical competition, because the British were making tremendous inroads into Burma, at first occupying the Burmese coast, and then gradually penetrating into the Burmese heartland by the late 19th century. The French, on the other hand, were sailing their warships into Vietnam, forcing the Nguyen rulers to make concessions. And by 1862, by the end of the 1860s, as a matter of fact, the French had taken control over southern Vietnam, and founded a direct colony, which is Cochin China. And eventually, this would the French would expand into the rest of Vietnam, forming what would be known as French Indochina. And this is the last slide. Yeah, I think I went over a little bit. Sorry about that. But in the end, after the death of King Ong Duam, his successor, King Norodom, decided that he was incredibly insecure because of Siam and Vietnam. And so he decided to find a third party, the French. And so in many ways, it was under his initiative that a French protectorate was established over Cambodia in 1863. And so the French now, in many ways, took over that position of a middleman and buffer between Siam and Vietnam, which at this point, of course, had come under French domination. And Siam, very interestingly enough, became a buffer between the British and the French. And under the French rule, Cambodia actually gained quite a bit, taking over a lot of the territories that were lost from Siam. So, yeah, that ends my slide. As you can see, this is very much a work in progress. I'm still thinking over a lot of these things, even as I'm doing this talk. So if you have any suggestions, any critiques, any comments, I would certainly welcome them. Thank you very much.